In the final decades of the 19th century, the most powerful nations on Earth divided Africa among themselves. They drew borders with rulers and ink in conference rooms in Berlin. They built railways, posted flags, and called it civilization. When it was done, nearly the entire continent wore the chains of a foreign master. Nearly. One kingdom looked at the rifles pointed at its chest and did not flinch. This is the true story of Ethiopia, the only African nation that defeated a European colonial army in open battle, the kingdom that said no and made it stick, and the men and women whose names Europe spent a century trying to forget. In November of 1884, 14 European nations gathered in the German capital of Berlin. The subject on the table was the continent of Africa, a landmass of 11 million square miles, home to hundreds of civilizations, thousands of languages, and hundreds of millions of human beings. None of those human beings were invited to attend. Over the following months, the delegates carved up Africa into spheres of influence, protectorates, and colonies. They used maps that were largely inaccurate. They drew straight lines through territories whose inhabitants had lived in sophisticated political and cultural organization for centuries. They called the process orderly. They called it progress. By 1900, roughly 90% of Africa had fallen under European control. Britain held Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, and much of Eastern and Southern Africa. France dominated the north and west. Belgium seized the Congo, where the cost of rubber extraction was paid in severed hands. Portugal, Germany, and Spain held their own corners of the continent. Into this landscape of conquest entered the Kingdom of Italy, unified only since 1861, restless for prestige, eager to prove itself alongside the older European powers. Italy looked toward the Horn of Africa. It established a foothold on the Red Sea coast at Massawa in 1885. It pushed inland, signing treaties with local chiefs, establishing what it called the Colony of Eritrea in 1890. What stood directly to the south, and what Italy fully intended to bring under its control, was the ancient empire of Ethiopia, known in European diplomatic circles as Abyssinia. Ethiopia was no tribal territory awaiting organization. It possessed its own alphabet, Ge'ez, one of the oldest writing systems in the world still in use. It had its own coinage, its own administrative bureaucracy, and an imperial lineage that traced its roots to the biblical union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This was the kingdom Italy intended to conquer. Before the defining confrontation arrived, there was Emperor Johannes IV, the warrior priest who ruled Ethiopia from 1871 until his death in battle in 1889 against the Sudanese Makdis forces at the Battle of Metemmah. Johannes had already resisted Italian encroachment along his northern frontier. He had already understood that the European powers posed an existential threat. But his death left the throne open, and into that opening stepped the man who would define what followed. Saleh Mariam was born in 1844, the son of the king of Shewa, one of Ethiopia's most powerful regional kingdoms. When he was 11 years old, Emperor Tewodros II, a rival to his father, had him captured and held at the mountain fortress of Magdala. He lived there as a royal hostage for a decade. He was educated. He observed, and in 1865, he escaped. That man, who had survived captivity, navigated court politics, and returned to claim his father's throne, would become Emperor Menelik II in 1889, following the death of Johannes. He was 45 years old when he assumed the imperial throne. He had already spent 30 years reading the continent around him. Menelik understood what many African rulers had not yet grasped in time, that the European powers were not merely trading partners or occasional military threats. They were systematically absorbing territory, and they would not stop unless made to stop. His response was methodical and far-sighted. He began acquiring modern weapons, not in small quantities, but at scale. He cultivated diplomatic relations with Russia and France, both of whom had strategic reasons to see Italian expansion in the region checked. He modernized his military structure while retaining the fierce loyalty and fighting capability of his regional commanders. Beside him stood Empress Taitu Betul, his wife and one of the most formidable political minds in Ethiopian history. Taitu was not a ceremonial figure. She was a diplomat, a strategist, and, when the time came, a military commander. She was deeply opposed to any agreement that surrendered Ethiopian sovereignty, and her opposition was not merely principled, it was tactical. She read the fine print of treaties. She understood what was being offered and what was actually being taken. In May 1889, Menelik signed the Treaty of Wuchale with Italy. On the surface, it was a straightforward agreement, establishing borders and recognizing diplomatic relations. But Article 17 of that treaty contained a trap, one that Italy may well have constructed deliberately. The Italian version of Article 17 stated that Ethiopia was obliged to conduct all of its foreign affairs through the Italian government. In effect, it made Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version, the one Menelik's delegates understood themselves to be signing, only stated that Ethiopia may, if it chose to, use Italian channels for foreign communication. The word obliged and the word may are separated by the entire question of national sovereignty. Italy immediately began informing other European powers that Ethiopia was now under its protection. Menelik received the communications. He studied both versions of the treaty, and in February 1893, he formally renounced it, sending notice to the major European powers that Ethiopia recognized no protectorate and answered to no foreign government. In Rome, the response was fury, and then a decision. If Ethiopia would not submit to a treaty, it would submit to a war. The Italian commander in Eritrea, General Oreste Baratieri, was widely regarded as a capable and experienced officer. He had served in the campaigns of the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy, under Garibaldi. He was confident, he was decorated, and he was dangerously wrong about what he was preparing to fight. Baratieri's force numbered approximately 17,000 men, Italian regulars supplemented by Eritrean colonial troops called Askari, who were armed with modern Vitelli and Gargano rifles, supported by 56 artillery pieces. By any conventional assessment of colonial warfare in the 1890s, this was a formidable force. In every previous engagement on African soil, such firepower had proven decisive. Baratieri's assumption, shared by the Italian government and the European press, was that the Ethiopian forces would behave as other African armies had behaved, that they would charge across open ground and be cut down. He did not know what Menelik had spent years preparing. Between 1887 and 1895, Menelik had imported approximately 100,000 rifles and dozens of artillery pieces, sourced from Russia, France, and even some suppliers the Italians might have preferred he not reach. Russia was particularly supportive. The Russian Orthodox Church viewed Ethiopia's ancient Christian empire as a natural ally, and Tsar Nicholas II's government had strategic reasons to oppose Italian expansion. French merchants, competing commercially with Italy throughout the region, were similarly forthcoming. But weapons alone do not win wars. Organization does. Unity does. In September 1895, Menelik issued an extraordinary proclamation to his people. It read in part, "Enemies have come who would ruin our country and change our religion. Our enemies have begun the affair by advancing and digging into the country like moles. With the help of God, I will not deliver my country to them. Today, you who are strong, give me your strength, and you who are weak, help me by prayer." The response was without precedent in the region. Warriors came from Shewa, from Tigray, from Gojam, from Wollo, from Harar. Women organized supply lines, carried provisions, and in many cases fought alongside the men. Estimates of the total Ethiopian force that assembled for the campaign ranged between 80,000 and 120,000 fighters. It was not a tribal militia, it was a national army. Empress Taitu rode at its head alongside Menelik. She brought her own force of 5,000 soldiers, including 600 cavalry. Her presence was not symbolic, she commanded. By the close of 1895, the two forces were converging in the mountains of Tigray, in the rugged terrain north of the town of Arua. Baratieri had already suffered a sharp defeat at the Battle of Amba Alaji in December 1895, where Major Pietro Toselli's column was surrounded and destroyed. Then came the Battle of Mekelle in January 1896, another Italian outpost forced into surrender. These were not minor skirmishes, they were warnings that went unheeded. Baratieri was under enormous pressure from Rome. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi sent him a telegram calling the military situation a military phthisis, a wasting disease, and demanding decisive action. Baratieri's own officers were divided. Some urged caution, others demanded the offensive. He chose the offensive. On the night of February 29, 1896, he ordered his three main columns to advance through the mountains toward Arua before dawn. The Italian advance began in darkness. Three brigades, under Generals Vittorio da Bormida, Giuseppe Arimondi, and Matteo Albertone, moved through separate mountain passes toward a series of ridgelines north of Arua. A fourth column, under Baratieri himself, followed in reserve. The plan required the columns to remain in contact with each other and converge at designated points before dawn. It did not work. The maps Baratieri's officers were using were inaccurate. The passes did not connect where the cartographers had drawn them. In the darkness and rugged terrain, the three columns lost contact with one another. Albertone's brigade, moving on the left flank, advanced too far and too fast, pushing deep into territory where Ethiopian forces were already massing. He sent messengers back to Baratieri reporting his position. The messages were unreliable. The messages arrived late or not at all. At first light on March 1, 1896, Albertone's brigade crested a ridge and found itself facing the full advance force of Menelik's army. Menelik and Taitu had positioned their forces through the night with an awareness of the terrain that the Italians simply did not have. Ethiopian fighters knew these mountains. They had been briefed. They had scouts on every ridge. When the Italian columns separated in the darkness, Ethiopian intelligence tracked each one. The battle that erupted on that morning was not a single engagement. It was three simultaneous ambushes, each one targeted at an isolated Italian column, each one designed to prevent relief from arriving. Albertone's brigade, some 4,000 men, was engulfed within the first hour. His artillery fired until their ammunition ran out. His infantry formed defensive squares. Ethiopian fighters, armed with the same modern rifles, poured fire from elevated positions on three sides. By mid-morning, the brigade had ceased to function as a military unit. Albertone himself was captured. Arimondi's column in the center moved to support Albertone and encountered the main Ethiopian force head-on. The fighting here was brutal and close. Ethiopian cavalry swung around the flanks. Riflemen held the high ground. Arimondi was killed in the engagement. His brigade disintegrated under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Da Bormida's column, on the right, marched into a valley with steep sides and no viable exit. The geography itself was a death sentence. Ethiopian forces fired from above on all sides. Da Bormida was killed. His men attempted to retreat and were pursued through the passes for miles. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a catastrophe. Baratieri, with his reserve column, watched his army collapse from a distance he could not close in time. He ordered a general withdrawal. There was almost nothing to withdraw. The battle lasted approximately 6 hours. When it was over, approximately 6,000 Italian and Eritrean soldiers were dead. Roughly 1,700 were taken prisoner. The Italian colonial army in Eritrea had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. It was the largest defeat of a European army by an African force in the entire colonial era. Menelik chose not to pursue the retreating Italians into Eritrean territory. It was a deliberate decision. He had achieved his objective, the destruction of the invasion force and the defense of Ethiopian sovereignty. A further advance risked drawing in other European powers. He pulled his army back, treated the Italian prisoners with documented care, and waited for the diplomatic consequences to arrive. They arrived swiftly. The news reached Europe by telegraph within days. The reaction in Italy was seismic. Prime Minister Crispi's government fell within weeks of the defeat. Riots broke out in Milan, Naples, and Rome. Protesters tore up the streets. The public could not process what the dispatches were reporting, that a colonial army with modern weapons and European military training had been destroyed by an African force in open battle. General Baratieri was court-martialed. He was ultimately acquitted on technicalities, but his career was finished. The Italian parliament was consumed for months by hearings and recriminations. The colonial project in East Africa lay in ruins. In October 1896, Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa. Under its terms, Italy formally and unconditionally recognized the sovereignty of the Ethiopian Empire. The fraudulent Treaty of Wuchale was annulled in its entirety. Ethiopia had not merely defeated an army, it had forced a European nation to sign a peace treaty acknowledging African independence, the first time such a document had been produced on the continent in the colonial era. The international consequences spread further than Italy's borders. In the United States, African-American newspapers covered the Battle of Adwa extensively. The victory electrified Black communities from Baltimore to New Orleans. It was proof, concrete, documented military proof, that African peoples were not destined for subjugation. Marcus Garvey later cited Adwa as a foundational moment in his political awakening. Haile Selassie's name became the defining symbol of Black liberation movements for generations, precisely because Ethiopia was the nation that had proven independence possible. Across the Caribbean and Latin America, in Haiti, the only other nation formed through a successful slave revolution, the battle resonated with particular force. In India, early nationalist voices pointed to Adwa as evidence that European military power was not invincible. Ethiopia was subsequently invited to the Hague Peace Conference of 1899, the only African nation present. It joined the International Postal Union. It was recognized diplomatically by the major powers on terms of something approaching equality. Again, a singularity on the continent. The story did not end without further violence. In 1935, Benito Mussolini invaded Ethiopia with a force of several 100,000 soldiers, deploying mustard gas against civilian populations in direct violation of the Geneva Protocol. Mussolini was explicit about his motivation. He was avenging Adwa. The occupation lasted until 1941, when British and Commonwealth forces, fighting alongside Ethiopian resistance fighters, the Arbignoc, drove the Italians out and restored Emperor Haile Selassie to his throne. Even that chapter ended with Ethiopia's restoration. The nation that could not be colonized permanently was still standing. Today, the colors of the Ethiopian flag, green, yellow, and red, appear in the national flags of more than 30 dozen countries. They were adopted deliberately, consciously, as symbols of the African resistance that Ethiopia embodied. The African Union, headquartered in Addis Ababa, carries those colors on its banner. The continent did not forget where its symbol of independence came from. The question that opens a story like this is always the same. How? How does a kingdom resist what every other territory on the continent could not? The answer is not simple, and it does not reduce to a single battle or a single man. It was Johannes IV holding the line at the borders before the decisive campaign. It was Menelik's 20 years of diplomatic patience and military preparation, acquiring weapons through relationships that Europe had not thought to block in time. It was Taitu Betul sitting across the table from Italian envoys and reading the clause they hoped she would not notice. It was 100,000 Ethiopians who answered a proclamation and walked into the mountains carrying their nation's future on their shoulders. Menelik II died in 1913, He's remembered in Ethiopia not as a conqueror, but as a unifier. The city of Addis Ababa, which he founded, bears his mark in its boulevards, its institutions, and its very name, which means new flower in Amharic. He brought the telegraph and the railway to his country. He built its first modern hospital. He did what leaders who survive existential threats so rarely find time to do. He built forward. The Battle of Adwa was recorded in 1896. In 2025, it remains the most decisive military defeat of a European colonial army by an African force in recorded history. It is taught in Ethiopian schools as the foundational moment of national identity. It is largely absent from the history curricula of the nations that sent that army. That absence is itself a lesson. If the story of Adwa was not in your history books, the question worth sitting with is not just why. The question is what else was left out, and what that silence has cost all of us in our understanding of the world. If Adwa deserves to be known, and it does, share this video with one person who has never heard of it. Drop a comment below with one word that describes Menelik II. And subscribe, because next week we go deeper into the African kingdoms that history buried, and the truth that is still waiting to surface.